Please welcome Associate Professor, University of Toronto, Aziza Chaouni. Founding Partner and CEO, Meridium, Thierry Deau. Managing Partner, 1955 Capital, Andrew Chung. And your moderator, Architect CEO, AD Consulting Limited, Olajumoke Adenowo.
Well, good morning, everybody. This discussion this morning is going to be how we can build stronger, smarter cities globally. And looking at the demographics of this panel, I'm thinking we've got Aziza, who's worked in North Africa and North America. I've got Thierry, who works mostly in Europe and the US. And we've got Andrew, who links clean tech in the US to Asian countries. It looks like I am the representative from sub-Saharan Africa. So I'd better say a few things about sub-Saharan Africa. And besides, I spent 12,000 miles and huge carbon emissions coming here. So I better make my carbon emissions count. So how do we build stronger, smarter cities globally? Would like to learn from this distinguished panel. Aziza, I'm so chuffed by your work on the Fez River in your hometown, because in Morocco, what did you learn? What lessons can we take away from the work you did on the Fez River?
Okay, so maybe I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the project. So my hometown, Fez, in Morocco, has the oldest medieval city in Morocco. And is actually one of the largest medieval cities in the world. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981, and it's very stunning. And what's very unique about it is that its urban fabric is very homogeneous, and that the city is actually very much lived in. I mean, I live in Fez, and when I need something specific, I actually still go to the old city to buy certain items, certain food, etc. So unlike other old cities in Morocco called the Medinas, it's still very much alive. And this city was built right next to a river for very obvious reasons, but with time, this river got very polluted, up to the point where it became a sewage, and slowly people started to cover it. And this actually caused a lot of issues, obviously health issues, but when the river started to be covered, the urban fabric of the city, which is completely pedestrian. Fez actually isn't the city in the world that has the largest pedestrian network. You can either walk or take a donkey if you have something heavy to carry. And this river, I've seen it, I mean, since, like I was born, slowly change from a river that in the songs of my grandmother was very much alive, full of fish and clean water, to a sewage actually where people would just dump trash, and where a lot of people that did craft that now used chemicals would literally dump the chemicals in the river. And this river then poured into the most fertile valley in Morocco. Mm-hmm. So it was actually a very, very big issue. And what I did propose first as my thesis, actually my thesis advisor is now the dean of the School of Architecture here, and he highly encouraged me to reimagine what this river could become. I was, of course, very naive, and I proposed something that was a bit too pricey, and I went and I showed my project to different people in the city, and very oddly, was only heard by the engineers.
At that point, I'd like to comment at that point. You proposed this solution to people in the city. Being an African myself, what I'm interested in is how did you get the stakeholders on board, government policy and all? It's like saying you just want to go to the Hudson and do something to it. How did you go about that?
Well, I would not have succeeded if I was not local. I mean, I was born and raised in Fez, so I knew how the system worked. But I think also it helped that, very oddly, that I was an engineer. No one wanted to talk to me when I said that I was an architect. But as soon as I said, I'm trained as an engineer, as a civil engineer, I was hired by the civil engineering and waterworks department of my hometown at first. And the idea was very simple. Why don't we clean the water? Why don't we daylight this river and create a set of public spaces along this river? And of course, it took a lot of efforts to take to people to believe that this was a river, because it has been for so long, even its name has changed officially to the River of Trash. So it took actually a long time, like a lot of effort, and I think one has to be a little bit mad in a way, because everyone was telling me that it was impossible, it was so expensive, but little by little, I think that local knowledge was really essential, and passion.
Fantastic, local knowledge. So when we engage and we're trying to build stronger and smarter cities, local knowledge is invaluable. We need to come in at the point where the people really need us and our expertise. Thierry, you do this kind of thing, do you get involved? How do you negotiate the politics, the geopolitics, the socioeconomics of the places where you deploy your long-term infrastructure investments? What have you found, especially maybe working in sub-Saharan Africa or even in France?
We actually work in sub-Saharan Africa, so you're not alone.
I know, I'm not.
No, I mean, I think for us what is very important as long-term investor and really caring for pension money and being invested for 25, 30 years in those projects is really engaging at the outset with communities. I think it's I think investors now are convinced, and it took me quite a while to convince them, but now I think everyone is on board with the fact that engaging with communities is a big risk mitigator on the long term. Investors, the first thing they're afraid of is what they call political risk, which they don't quite know what it is. And political risk is really the manifestation of an unhappy stakeholder putting influence and influencing a decision maker that would eventually do something not necessarily in the right direction. So clearly engaging at the outset from design phase to financing phase with the communities from different perspectives. There is the project and whatever the common good is supposed to produce, but there's also what's in it for me as a stakeholder. So shared benefit and impact is very important. So, I mean, when we worked, for example, on building these solar plants in Senegal, in sub-Saharan Africa, we spent more time on making sure that the villages around where we committed contractually, not just talk, but on creating jobs, training kids that didn't go to school to be able to be involved in construction, maintenance, but also engaging with the women there with another NGO that helped us set up a mutual fund to support women businesses around those projects. So it's very involved, and you really have to, if you want your project to be resilient, then focus on that engagement.
Okay, so one of the values of Solve is human-centeredness, which means we want to make sure that at the end of the day, whatever we do in the communities, we get the communities to be the drivers of the cause and those who actually protect the cause, rather than those who take up arms and go to City Hall against the cause. So we have to make sure it's human-centered. And that brings me to something that I think about when we think about engaging with sub-Saharan Africa. Another one of the values of Solve is open innovation, which means that we really do believe that ingenuity is everywhere, and we should engage everyone to bring their solutions to the table. But I'm wondering these days that a lot of sub-Saharan Africa is not heard. Africa has become dark, not because it's dark in its thinking, but its voice is dark, if we can say that. So recently, I was just talking to Aziza that, recently there was a TED search in Lagos, Nigeria, that's supposed to bring people to Arusha to come and talk about their best ideas. But then the audience was squirming because out of the 14 Nigerians who spoke, 10 were from one ethnic group. And there are 300 ethnic groups in Nigeria. And it's because the West has become less adventurous with engaging with Africa. Chris Anderson was in the room himself, but his advisors were from the ethnic group that the 10 were from. Now, as Africans, we understand that, or maybe from the Middle East, you understand what it means, that we've got 300 languages, and you brought 10 people who speak the same language. But in the past, it was easier to engage. No, the West was more adventurous. I've got professors who are from Trieste in Italy. There were people, when the internet did not give us this idea that we're so connected, when we really are not, people made more of an effort to engage with the communities, get the stakeholders on board, understand the thinking, understand where people are coming from. Bringing me to you, Andrew. I know you know what I really would like to ask, but I won't do that now. Yeah, because Andrew used to be he had 3 record deals. And yes, you had 3 record deals, and he won the Hong Kong version of the American Idol. And I'd like to know, was it an epiphany? How did you come from signing autographs to signing checks? As a venture capitalist, what made that?
That was not part of the list of questions.
Yeah, I know it wasn't. I'm good like that. You know.
Well, since you asked, it's actually not unrelated to the topic of the conference and why all of you are assembled today. Music making for me was a way of connecting with audiences and generating emotion in people when I was able to perform a piece of music that was either very uplifting or very emotional or very sad. And so I really enjoyed that, and actually it framed a lot of the way that I do business, work with customers, present to folks like yourselves. But I also found that I had a lot of educational training and a lot of study in areas like energy and environment, study of how people do business in Asia, and the ability to take a lot of those skills and try to have a significant impact and really solve one of the great challenges of our time, which is how do you create better opportunities and a better life for people in developing countries where they don't have the resources that we have here in the United States, and they don't have access to a lot of the healthcare, education, or clean living that we have here in the US.
Okay. So if I may jump in, some wonder how well prepared US firms are, to solve problems in Asia. Do you find that there's a fit? Are you able to create that bridge?
That's what I try to do. It's a very challenging problem because you have a lot of distrust among partners in between the United States and China. Many of the companies that I've represented in my time at Lightspeed, Khosla, and now 1955 don't know who the large companies are in China or Malaysia or Indonesia. They don't speak the same languages. They don't understand the local customs or the way to negotiate. And so many of the times when we have a great technology here in the United States that is bursting at the seams to expand in countries that are desperate for their technology, we run into this issue of how you can bring the two sides together to transact and really deploy those technologies in these geographies that are, again, very desperate for it. I think one of the things that a lot of the American and European entrepreneurs that I've worked with perhaps don't see day to day is the massive opportunity that there is in places like China, Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East. China is about to become the undisputed leader in deploying a lot of these technologies because close to 2 million people are dying a year of air pollution-related disorder. There are 300 million people that don't have potable drinking water. It's the fastest growing middle class of all time, yet they question the safety of their food, whether or not the doctors in their country can heal them, all while everyone now has the ability to afford it, and because of social media, they can see how everyone else in the world lives. And so the opportunity for an entrepreneur and for a lot of the technologies in the United States and Europe to influence the course of how China, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa will develop is quite staggering. And as it relates to the topic of this panel, it also happens to be the place where all the largest new cities are being developed. There's a city just south of Beijing that is about to be formed called Xiong'an that was just recently announced as the newest new economic zone for China, similar to Shenzhen. This city is going to be 2.5 times the area of New York City. It's going to be built from the ground up, which creates all sorts of opportunities for entrepreneurs, whether you're doing renewable energy, grid scale storage, energy efficiency, redefining the grid, sustainable building materials going in, the infrastructure around electric vehicles, autonomous driving, Internet of Things, and connecting all the infrastructure in these cities. I could spend an entire day just talking about all the different types of technologies that can go into making these cities smarter, greener, and better for a country that just decided to stop the building of 100 coal-fired plants.
Okay.
China.
So this is what it seems to be the impediment worldwide. There are needs in some areas, and there's the resources in other areas, but we're not talking, and we're not communicating, and perhaps we're not even looking inwards to solve our own problems ourselves. Because when you talk about China developing a building from scratch. I know for sure that Nigeria is going to need 18 million housing units, and we need it already like yesterday, not tomorrow. Now, this is the problem. If Africa develops in exactly the same way in which the West developed, then the whole planet is in trouble. We must leapfrog into the technologies of the future. And what that means is that we must also have the confidence to contrive our own solutions ourselves. Because many times when you come to Africa and you try to China or Morocco or North Africa and try to solve the problems for us, they may not be culturally relevant, economically relevant, socially relevant, and people end up not using them. You understand? Like, I look at African traditional architecture, and I believe just like in North Africa and other places, our own local architecture has a lot to teach the world in terms of sustainability, and we have global relevance. Take for instance, there's zero carbon footprint to building materials. We take it from the earth. There's inclusion. There's nobody who rents a house in a village. Nobody does. Every member of the community makes sure you have somewhere to live. Even the women get involved. They produce materials, they actually build. So there's a lot that our traditional architecture has to teach us that is globally relevant and is exportable to the entire planet. And it's in everybody's best interest that we make sure that every region works. We have a saying in Nigeria which says that if you watch your neighbor or your house, your family member eating bad things, and you think it doesn't matter, you're not the one eating it. When he begins to grunt at night, you are the one who's not going to sleep. So that's what happens when we dabble in other regions and we don't make sure that the whole world is settled. The reason why I came on a jetliner yesterday and I'm leaving tonight is because there's enough to go back to. My home is safe. I'm doing something significant. I can afford my lifestyle. That's why I'm not a refugee. So we have to make sure that the whole world is an organism and it's all functioning the way it should function. The time for being selfish is over. So coming to you, Aziza, you've done such fascinating things.
You're so kind.
But it is the truth. Such romantic, fascinating projects that you've been involved in. There's the Al-Kawarine Library. 859. It was actually founded by another woman, a Tunisian, and you got the opportunity to restore it. Yep. But what I find interesting in what you did is you just didn't restore it. You made sure that it was open to the public. Why did you do this? What did you have to pass through? Because you don't let people enter, school children, everybody just enter into a country's revered medieval museum. What kind of clout do you have to make that kind of thing happen?
Well, I think I have to come back to what it means to be an architect and what it means to me. And I think the profession, I don't want to, point any fingers here, but I think we have forgotten today as architects to be citizens. And architecture has become a business like any other business, and we really forget very often to give back. And I really felt when I got the commission to restore the oldest library in Morocco, that I had to give something back. I mean, this library, I have grown up in Fez, and I was never able to step inside this library. I knew that my great-grandfather actually studied in this library, but it was just closed to the public. It had rare books. It had Qurans that were, from the 8th century, 9th century. It has, amazing manuscripts. And for the first time, when I actually had to restore it, this is when I looked at this manuscripts. It was a very emotional moment, but I also felt that it was my duty. I just felt I could not do otherwise to actually create a small space where those manuscripts could be exhibited, and maybe some areas of the library could be open to the public. And it was not easy. So my job as an architect could have been to just restore, do a great job, everything is working great, but I felt that it was not enough. And I think, again, to come back to changing mentalities, I think sometimes the fight is that, the easy path is to just accept the statu quo, but in Morocco, a library, the meaning of a library and our archival library is not the same as the one that you have here in the West, where the library is open, has a Starbucks and so forth. It's basically, for a lot of people, it's an elitist space, and that's not accessible, and I really wanted to make it accessible. So it was a challenge.
So for you, architecture is not about the aesthetics. It's not the stuff for just architectural record or something. It's really about social impact. That's what architecture should be at. It's about the spirit of the age, and what is really going on in the universe. And that's what we should be drawing attention to as architects, not just in our building types, but in our cities, as cities should reflect what is really going on in the age. Now, talking about cities reflecting, you've been to Lagos and you were in traffic, as you had been if you were in Bangkok or you were in Bangalore. What can we do about the choices we've made about transportation? What kind of long-term infrastructure, can we deploy? Because it's a huge problem. Apart from the carbon emissions, some people live their life in traffic, in the commute, and it's cutting lives short.
I mean, in addition to carbon emission, the economic cost of congestion is just
something
astronomous. So it's an issue that needs to be solved, and it's not an option. I think Lagos will not be livable if this problem is not solved within the next 10, 15 years.
I'm thinking of getting a helicopter, but...
But there may be traffic on the helicopter pads also. So, and that's the real danger. So, I mean, I think there are a number of issues in terms of how can we invest more in the sort of clean mobility in large cities, and especially when it's a bit too late already. There are two fundamental issues. One is, obviously, you need a bit of a planning, and that's the engineer inside me that talks. You do need to plan, and you do need to integrate the technologies in there, and that's where the leapfrog can be helpful, because I think it's easier today to think about clean mobility in a city like Lagos than it was 20 or 30 years ago, thanks to technology. And that does need, and for me, that's a generic issue in infrastructure investment, is that the capacity on the public sector side is often very low. And so building capacity in cities to be able to focus on these topics and plan and have a real mobility plan is essential. The other thing is, and
so
that...
we start, if I may comment, we start from the public sector, from the planning. The governments have to be educated. The policymakers have to be prepared before we start thinking.
Because the policymakers, their responsibility is actually to engage with the public and say, this is what we really need, and then sort of devise a bit of a plan. They can get help. The other side is, I mean, clean mobility, because of the way it's been financed over the years, requires fundamental changes in fiscal policy, which is one of the reasons why most governments kind of stay away from it or think that it's going to happen without major fiscal policy changes. Because clean mobility is about also sustainability, affordability. And affordability raises two questions. Who is going to eventually fund this mobility? Who's going to eventually fund your tram, your BRT, you name it? And we've tried every model around the world. It does take the users to pay some of it, taxpayers to pay some of it. So that does mean that you really need to think seriously about how you collect tax and how you allocate tax money into those projects, which does mean a real democratic and community discussion, which most community leaders would try to avoid. And so those two issues are quite fundamental if you want something sustainable to happen, because pouring money into things has never solved anything. And I mean, to go a little bit more on the general side of things, when we think about infrastructure investment gap, and I was again last week in Durban for the World Economic Forum for Africa, it's not the lack of money that is the problem. It's the lack of capacity on both public and private side to actually tackle the issues, and the lack of engagement with communities to really find the right solutions.
I need to comment. I don't think it's a lack of capacity most times. It's that people are not talking to each other. In Nigeria, we have over 16,000 PhDs. So, and when we talk about capacity, I know we have home-trained people who have the capacity to solve our own problems. Home-trained is a key word here because it's very important. I went to a university where I learned apart from all other forms of architecture, tropical architecture. And so this solution that we think we can fly people in from MIT or from Harvard to drop pavilions in Africa.
I didn't mean it that way, though.
No, I don't. I know you don't mean it that way. But you know,
I meant it in a way where the government, they may have 5,000 PhDs in the back, but they don't hire them.
They're not engaged.
They don't hire them.
They're not hiring
so
them.
they need to bring them in.
Yes, I agree. But the capacity is there. But then the bridge again, you know, it's important. So how do one of the challenges, I mean, if you look at China's carbon emissions and where China still has to go, and say, for instance, the problem with flooding in a city like Shenzhen, which is built on a delta, we see that it's a concern for even me in Nigeria, because we suffer the worst of climate change in Africa. We're not responsible for it, we're bearing the brunt of it, because Lake Chad has shrunk. Lake Chad is a huge lake near where you hear about the Boko Haram situation going on, and it has shrunk 95% from what it was in the 60s. Perhaps this is also why people are getting radicalized, because they can no longer fish, they can no longer do anything, so they're there for the imams to fill their heads with all kinds of stuff. So climate change is a real issue. So it's a concern to the entire world how China develops. What can entrepreneurs do to make sure that China develops in a sustainable way?
Well, I think that at the senior government levels, there's clearly an imperative to invest more in these types of technologies and advances. So depending on which source you count on, one of the more common numbers being thrown around is that China will likely spend close to $400 billion US between now and the end of the decade on clean energy related technologies, which, depending on what you think of the current administration, might be 2 to 5 times more than the US government will spend on that area. So there's clearly an imperative to do more of that kind of investing. I think the main question is China going to invest in more of the same type of technology that's been around for the last 10 to 15 years, or are they going to be betting on things that are a bit more of a disruptive leap? So one of the companies that I had the honor of being on the board of for a long time was a company called LanzaTech. LanzaTech has developed a technology that can convert waste gas that comes out of different factories, steel mills, coal-fired plants, et cetera, and convert the carbon biochemically into a valuable fuel or chemical. So they're able to solve 2 environmental issues in one process. This was a technology that in the United States, we had very serious difficulties getting partners to work with us, to invest in the pilot plant, difficulties getting the EPA or the White House to be involved. And so when we brought it to different folks in Asia, China immediately jumped at it. We were able to raise close to $100 million to build 2 pilot plants with no funding coming from the company itself. And once we were able to prove that the technology and the economics worked, all of a sudden, global partners, Siemens, SK, Mitsui, ArcelorMittal, all started to pay attention, and they were willing to invest to build our first commercial plant. So it's a great example of how, for an entrepreneur, working with different global groups to identify ways to test emerging technology that is a disruptive leap becomes very important in order to bring these technologies to the world. And China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, where the demand is the sharpest, where there's a lot of resources being thrown at these types of problems, are a very good haven for entrepreneurs to go, because on one hand, it accomplishes what you suggested, which is it gives a country like China more tools to be able to combat the issues of climate change that affect their country. And surely, not unlike the situation in Nigeria, or thinking about how climate change affects the citizens, if the government doesn't do something about it, it could cause a revolution. So entrepreneurs being able to work with these countries where they demand these technologies to scale up and commercialize, and then ultimately bring that technology to the world, I think is a very, very important mission for all of us.
So definitely entrepreneurs can get involved. And I actually think that entrepreneurs sometimes are an alternative government sometimes. Instead of waiting for what big government can do about it, maybe we need to make a move. And when talking about...
Can I make one comment about the
Sure, of course you can.
Yeah, and one thing about the transportation infrastructure, one of the countries that I think did a very simple but creative way of solving the congestion problem, and thereby showing the power of how cities, with the right type of urban planning and government support, can really do something about these issues is Singapore. So if any of you have been to Singapore, you'll know that when you're driving in closer to the center of the city, all of a sudden, the toll goes up. So you are charged incrementally more for driving in the more congested areas.
Like in London too, it's called a congestion charge.
And it had a significant impact on the evening out the density of congestion and also just the resulting footprint that comes through it. But I think a lot of the new cities and also the rebuilding of existing cities, there's such an incredible opportunity to leverage autonomous driving, electric vehicle infrastructure, and different techniques to regulate how people access these public modes of transportation to really reduce the carbon footprint.
If we're talking about vehicles, then I think we need to say a word or two about making sure that what we decide to do is culturally acceptable. I see Kent Larson's obviously brilliant idea for the foldable car and pet, but I know that it's not going to work in Nigeria now because your aspiration is to go to school, work very hard, and buy a big car. So I don't know who is going to tell you. If you come back home at Christmas with a small car, your mom is going to think she spent, something went wrong with you. And it's not just Nigeria. It's, we found out that the underserved communities, which are the people that Solve is trying to get a solution for, their aspirations are exactly the same as those of the role models, the rich people they see. So if you're driving a Bentley or a Jaguar or a huge Lincoln, they want to do the same thing. They'll take a late model and a gas guzzler if they have to, but they need to do the same thing. So I think we also have to understand partnership across sectors. So while we're talking about the intelligentsia, we're actually preaching to the choir here, Out there, we still have, dare I say, presidents who don't believe in climate change and tweet about it. So we need to make sure that we're communicating to people in language that they understand, which might be Disney, you see. It might be The Circle of Life. It might be Lion King. It might be Hollywood. The message must be subtle but consistent. Because while you still have James Bond driving a gas guzzler and not a blue Prius, nobody is going to be interested in a foldable car. So maybe what we want to do is make sure the next Jason Bond movie is driving an electric red Tesla. And then we begin to talk to people, you understand, the way, partner with people who can really make a difference. In Africa, you talked about partnering with women. Women they seem weak, but they're not as weak as they are because the hand that rocks the cradle actually rules the world. And women actually just, by being role models, I'm who I am because my mother is a professor of history and my father is a professor. So I wasn't told what I could do, I just saw it. So one of the key tools we have is educated mothers, which is part of what we can do. I mean, we're talking about cities when we're talking about educated mothers because women are nurturers and they care about the next generation being able to breathe clean air. Refugees is what I want to talk about. Morocco has that problem with refugees, and so does your adopted country, Canada. How are they coping with it? Do you think there are any lessons that the United States can take away?
I love this question, I have to say. It makes me feel better that I live in Canada now, not in the US. But that's another question. Canada actually, as of today, has received 35,000 Syrian refugees. So its pledge actually, has been reached, and they are actually continuing to receive more refugees. And
I felt it was a clapping moment, but I'm trying to restrain myself. That was good.
And I was actually quite amazed at how citizens and how different organizations, not just the government, I think 50% of refugees are sponsored by private organizations or citizens. Our own School of Architecture sponsored a family, a Syrian family. But I was also amazed at all of the different platforms that emerged. One of them in Ontario is called Home. It's a platform that links different citizens on how they can donate. They can also donate a room, they can donate clothes, they can donate books, teaching or whatsoever with refugees that arrive. So this actually, for me, was quite stunning to see how generous and how quickly the city has reorganized itself and how people have opened, kind of their homes. A lot of empty nesters have opened bedrooms and so forth. But also, like the other side of the coin is that this sudden arrival, this huge number of refugees, has shed light on a big issue in Canada, which is the lack of social housing. A lot of these refugees were housed, the one that was sponsored by the government, in hotels, sometimes in military camps. And Canada, in the past 25 years, cut down 46% of its budget for social housing. And again, if we have to speak about, and some people in Ontario have to wait for 10 years to have access to social housing, they're on waiting list. And I think that to make more sustainable cities, we need to make more inclusive cities, and social housing is a key point. I think the right to housing is a very important right anywhere in the world.
Fantastic. So Thierry, if you're going to give us a word in closing on how to build sustainable, strong, smarter cities, what would that be to this crowd?
Let me take my magic wand.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think if I was to put everything around one word, would be inclusion. Inclusion because of the communities, inclusion because of a different side of the city, but inclusion, when I see partnership between public and private, are probably what will make a success of better sustainable city. And so, and partnership doesn't just happen because you declare it. It's a lot of work. And it's also building trust. And to build trust, you need transparent process, good ways of engaging between public and private, which is, in this country in particular, always a big issue. And so finding that transparency, that engagement on multiple sides would actually be able to, because all the solutions, whether technical or financial, are there. It's about putting it together and putting the people together to work for a common goal.
Fantastic. So we all have the solutions, but we need platforms like Solve so we can keep talking to each other and cross-fertilizing, making sure these ideas continue to move. Yeah. Several major Western countries have moved politically towards parties, governments that actually deprioritize climate change. Is this the drift in Asia? Is this something we need to be concerned about?
I think it's something we need to be very concerned about.
In Asia?
Well, no, I think just in general,
Okay.
and I'll come to Asia in a moment. There was a flurry of news this morning, actually, from some of the Asian countries, particularly China, around the current administration's desire to take a real step back from the Paris Accords and a lot of the climate convention agreements that the Obama administration had entered into and actually took the lead on a couple years ago. So in 2014, President Obama and President Xi of China signed a climate accord that was one of the most historic things to ever happen, where two major countries stepped out publicly to say that they were going to target a certain level of carbon emission reduction over time. And to get China to the table at that time, most experts thought was quite a miracle. And 3 years later, less than 3 years later, the tables have turned. It's China saying, US, what are you doing? Why are you stepping back? If you step back, it's going to affect sanctions. It's going to affect trade. And other G20 countries are saying the same thing. So right now, I worry a great deal that it's not just the US, but some of the other Western countries, as you noted, are taking a step back from these very delicate issues that took years and years, almost decades to build up to, where everyone finally has gotten to the table to talk about these things, and now the West is starting to pull out. So I think on one hand, it could have certain political repercussions on how these countries work together, because it is about partnership. It is about, do we trust the other partner to come through on their obligations? On the other hand, it also affects the leadership that the United States currently has in the development of a lot of these technologies and proliferation. And that becomes a human capital question. I mentioned to some of the panelists earlier that at Lightspeed and Khosla, we actually invested in more MIT technology spinouts than any other university in the areas of energy and sustainability. And that requires investment. That requires nurturing from the government, funding for a lot of these types of fundamental science technologies. Dr. Ernie Moniz, who is the former Secretary of Energy and also MIT professor, is going to be speaking a little bit later today about some of these types of technologies. And if the administration is pulling back significantly on these types of investments, if other Western governments are pulling back from these types of science-based investments, it could set the field of science in these areas back a decade or more, even though it may be a short-lived period where these investments are getting pulled back. So I do think that this is a very interesting time in history where the tables may turn, where Asia may take a very significant leadership position, not only in terms of the scale of deployment, but also the leadership in a lot of the technology development. So we need to act. We need to continue to invest in these important technologies.
And continue to be politically aware as we go forward. If we're going to end this session, I think we should end it on a note of optimism. I mean, if we're going to give a call to action to the participants at Solve, it reminds me, and it's one of the values of Solve, optimism. I have a younger son, I've got two sons. The younger one, TJ, was about 5 years old. And then he wrote an essay in his Crooked Child Writing and said, he was 5 years old. And he said, when I grow older, I'd like to go to MIT and I'd like to design intelligent robotic arms. While he was busy studying, somebody's done that, but he'll think of something else, I'm sure. You know, intelligent robotic arms for those who have lost their limbs. But you see, it brings me to somewhere, optimism. He was young, and he knew that if it was going to be, it was up to him. That's one thing. Two, he knew MIT are a community of solvers, and those who are around them are a community of solvers, and he wanted to be a solver. And that brings me to what we should do going on from here. When we pass and we see a problem, we hear it on CNN, Al Jazeera, whatever it is, and we say to ourselves, somebody must do something about that. You need to remember that you are somebody. You are somebody, and there is something you can do. You might say, well, I can do precious little. There's not much I can do. But I've taken the stand that it is better to light a candle than to cast the darkness. So no matter how little it is, when we come to fora like this, we must go away with asking ourselves, I have heard about the fact that we need partnership, human-centeredness. We need to participate with governments. We're not talking to each other. What am I doing about it? To build stronger and smarter cities, those who believe in the cause like you must become stronger and bolder in their cause and smarter in the terms of engagement and in partnership across board and across sectors. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.